Welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and today we're talking with Alex Harris. Alex is an attorney and author who, with his twin brother Brett, as teenagers created therevolution.com and wrote the book Do Hard Things, A Teenage Rebellion Against Low Expectations. Alex is a graduate of Harvard Law School and worked as a law clerk for U.S. Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Anthony Kennedy. He was also named to Forbes 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy. And before we talk to Alex, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying our interviews, it would help us if you gave us a review wherever you listen, especially Spotify. Now let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the dean of Talbot School of Theology.
Okay, well, super. We're going to jump right into our conversation, and so thankful to have you, Alex, and to kind of walk through some of this conversation. That's quite an impressive bio leading in. Not an underachiever, but I would expect you not to be an underachiever because the revolution, because of doing hard things, those are good. But I reached out to you when I watched the documentary. A lot of people watch Shiny Happy People, and in there you talked about the Joshua generation, but just barely. And I actually want to talk some. Because what your perception of the documentary was as well, more positive, more negative, whatever. But let's start with, because I don't know that everybody's going to be as familiar with the Joshua generation was. What was your involvement in it? And so let's start by unpacking there.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ed. And I do think the Joshua generation idea and story is an important one. It's why I originally agreed to be part of the Shiny Happy People documentary. And what that refers to is really an idea within the Christian homeschool movement of the 1980s, 1990s, where my parents were really influential pioneers. And the concept was, we're like Moses as Christian homeschool parents. We're pulling our kids out of public schools, kind of out of a decaying popular culture, and we're going to raise them in the wilderness. But then they're going to be like Joshua. They're going to rise up and they're going to take the land, take America back for God by achieving positions of power and influence in government and law, in the media, and so on. And, part of this is your typical, parents want their kids to succeed and everyone thinks little Jimmy is going to be president someday. But it was a bigger kind of spiritual, religious analogy that was really, pushed by a lot of Christian homeschool leaders that inspired the launch of a lot of institutions, whether that was homeschool speech and debate or political training, both campaigning as well as navigating the political process, and institutions like my alma mater, Patrick Henry College, that were designed to be a place for Christian homeschool graduates to be trained and sent out to lead the nation and shape the culture. And there's, an aspect of that which, is perfectly healthy and good. As Christians, we are called to be salt and light. We are called to seek the welfare of our communities, to be engaged and active in society, and that includes politics. But there was I think a deeper part of that, which I think was unhealthy. And I bought, completely into that vision growing up, where my vision of what it meant to be a faithful Christian was to achieve earthly power. Mm-hmm. And my vision of what it meant for Christianity to be in a healthy place in America was when we have political power and favor and influence. And that, I think, is at best a distortion, and at worst a complete idol and contrary to the true message of what it means to be a faithful Christian. And so that movement, that idea has had kind of widespread effects within the Christian homeschool movement. And as I and many other Christian homeschool graduates have continued to be faithfully taught by our pastors, continued to read our Bibles, I think we've started to question some of those ideas and whether or not they're truly aligned with biblical principles.
Yeah, and of course, this is tangential, the whole conversation around Christian nationalism and more. It's not like a direct line between the two, but certainly there's substantial overlap. But for most people, maybe they're depending upon, like I said, I read the Revolution. I engaged some of the resources over the years as a pastor and a church leader. But for some people, they may be less familiar, and maybe Shiny Happy People, which I think like broke all kinds of records, was their first introduction. And I guess I would say first, there were some things in there that were just, for example, when they called Wheaton College a fundamentalist school, I was kind of like, having served at Wheaton College, I probably wouldn't put that in that category in any way. But, of course, Gothard was a graduate from there. But what was your perception or your review, if you will, of the documentary? Because it seemed like you were sort of making very clear why you agreed to be in this, which sort of maybe I inferred that in part that meant you weren't pleased with everything. But tell me.
Yeah, I do give it a somewhat mixed review for the reasons that you pointed out, which is that, to the extent it tried to tell this larger story or paint with a kind of a broader brush certain Christian institutions or evangelical Christianity as a whole. There were many things that you could point to as unfair, inaccurate. I think the filmmakers in the series kind of overstepped in quite a few places. And the reason that was disappointing to me, one of the reasons was I wanted them to really kind of talk about this Joshua generation idea more than a surface level, more than just a scary headline, homeschool students are trying to take over government, to talk about, why is that not biblical? Why is that not a faithful vision for Christian witness in society? And all of that was left out. So that was one disappointment. The bigger disappointment, because the bigger focus of the docuseries was on, Bill Gothard, the type of, really soul-crushing, anti-gospel type of rules and teachings that he kind of layered onto his followers. A lot of that could just be lost in the noise of X, Y, and Z mischaracterizations, uncharitable, sweeping judgments. And so a lot of the people who I think could most benefit from taking a close look at this documentary and saying, wow, how do I, embrace or support, these types of teachings within members of my congregation, or, in what ways as Christian leaders have we not kind of confronted teaching in the church, just because this is someone who's with us on the inerrancy of Scripture and they're a conservative Bible preaching pastor. Therefore, we're going to let all these things slide. Like that type of introspection, which I think is really healthy for the church to engage in. It's so easy to just shut that door entirely when you hear, the first, the second, the third, just kind of unfair characterization of Christianity. And so I think that was a failure of the docuseries. That I
would also say too, having watched it though, there was a lot of failure, and I guess a lot of it's just not understanding the difference between evangelicals and fundamentals, but there's lots of others. But there was also a lot important in there as well, and you've articulated that elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I was privileged to get to write a review of the series for the Gospel Coalition, and kind of try to tease out some of these things to acknowledge, like, yes, it's so easy to say, just another example of, popular culture in the media making fun of Christians and pointing out how weird we can be. And, should we just tune it out and say, hey, we've had enough of this, the hits just keep coming and we're not going to pay attention, or should we lean in and actually say, what can we learn here? And there's, like you said, a whole lot that can be learned. And I think, the series, flawed as it may be, serves the church for those willing to seriously engage with it and consider, what is true, what it does reveal, and what the implications are, far beyond just, Bill Gothard and, his institute.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that for a lot of people, they didn't know that Bill Gothard was, Wheaton College graduate, how influential. I first encountered the Institute for Basic Life Principles. I don't think I've ever said this publicly. So when I was planting a church in Buffalo, New York, and there were some people who'd come to our church and they said, let's go to the Rochester, it was like a stadium. And I don't know what stadium it was, but it was a stadium. And we, kind of went through and filled out that book, the basic book, and more. I came back and was like, And you use, I could sort of tell where you were when you referred to the teachings as soul crushing and anti-gospel. Subtle 4 words, but so I sort of know where you are. But let's get to that. But let's start by, why do you think so many Christians were attracted to that version of the Christian life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think I should start by saying I grew up with so many families who were very much involved in IBLP, Institute and Basic Life Principles, Gothard's organization, and then specifically his homeschool arm was the Advanced Training Institute, where you kind of dived a lot deeper than just those original basic seminars. And so many of those families, they were families where they were trying to be faithful. They were trying to follow God. They were trying to do what was best for their kids. And, here was this man who, was a very good communicator, who was a very kind of clear, at laying out, here are these principles that are he said, derive directly from the Bible.
Directly from the Bible, yeah.
And, there's a kernel of truth to the fact that God created the world, not just with physical laws, but with moral laws. And there's something about keeping yourself in line with biblical principles that can, not always, but can, lead to greater flourishing. And so he seized on that idea and then kind of, expanded on it to the point where, if you follow these principles, you will, have a good marriage. You will have, God following children who are well behaved. You will achieve success in your business and your financial life. And it actually, became, I think, a form of a prosperity gospel, which, of course, as evangelicals, we associate with, very different teachers, not a conservative, Bible teacher like Bill Gothard, but it's the same thing, just in a different form. And there's a real deep-seated appeal to that type of message, because who doesn't want a good marriage, and who doesn't want their children to love God and to be, well-behaved and obedient? Who doesn't want to have, this simple, straightforward, if you do this, you will get the thing that you want? I think at root, we all would love that. The problem is that it doesn't work like that. And, those principles quickly became rules that not just, promised reward if you followed them, but also promised punishment, a lack of protection against Satan's attacks if you didn't follow them, and just created a very rigid, fear-based and extra biblical form of following God that was, which is why you described it the way I did.
Yeah. And part of the challenge even in this conversation is, how much should we talk about Bill Gothard? How much should we talk about Shiny Happy People? I would really, we're going to link in the show notes the title, just so you get the idea of the title of the article. It's Amazon's Shiny Happy People has lessons to teach if we're willing to listen. So don't think that Alex is discounting, or I am. I think I watched the totality of the series with my wife, discussed it, talked to some other people about it. But I want to kind of lean in on which I think you hoped that the documentary would and did not, which is to lean in some on the Joshua generation, or Generation Joshua. It seems like it's referred to in different places in different order. So there was this movement. You're trying to, you kind of withdrew from society in a sense, Benedict option-ish for those who are listeners, that Roger's book on, and created systems, and then you were going to go back in. So you go to Harvard. You're an attorney now. You worked in government and more. So this is portrayed very briefly in Shiny Happy People and nefariously elsewhere. There have been people who have written on this as like it's a nefarious, right-wing kind of religious plot to take over. So what? Give us more. Give us more about what it was, and then I want to ask you, after you explain more what it was, why you've changed your mind. But it's important to note, you've not walked away from evangelicalism. You've not walked away from conservative evangelicalism. Others have. We'll talk about why. But first, give us a little more on Joshua generation.
Yeah, and I'll first address the terminology because it
Yeah,
is confusing, and
yeah.
even people who kind of come from the similar background will
Please.
use those interchangeably. The Joshua generation, I think, is how I refer to it because it refers to the idea, kind of that biblical analogy. Um, Generation Joshua, and this is where it gets confusing, is an actual organization
Right.
that was created by the Homeschool Legal Defense
Right.
Association, Virginia, and trains young people in political campaigning. And so obviously, you can see the
It's definitely related.
parallels.
Yeah.
It's definitely related, but the organization is not the movement or the idea.
Helpful. Okay.
Kind of, it's maybe one subpart.
Okay.
And in fact, there are some great people who are now involved in that organization who would very much disagree with some of the more take the country back for God,
Okay.
maybe some distortions of
Sure.
the Christian message. So that's just the first part. But to go back to what the idea is, what that looked like within the Christian homeschool movement. If you look back to the 1980s and earlier, this was kind of rising at the same time as kind of the rise of the moral majority, the religious right, a lot of conservative political organizations that arose at the same time, and a lot of the leaders in the Christian homeschooling movement were overlapping within those two worlds. And one of the most influential voices in both of those worlds was kind of a Presbyterian philosopher called R.J. Rushdoony.
Rushdoony, sure.
Yeah, and he was an advocate of what he called Christian Reconstructionism, which was this for him very long-term vision of Christians building up communities and eventually seeing a millennium of Christian reign over the entire world before.
And that millennium really matters. The word millennium really matters in this, but keep going.
Yeah. But with that kind of, eschatological vision that he had was this, kind of underlying idea of eventually, Christians will take control.
Right.
And he paired that with a strong philosophy of there is no neutral ideas. Every policy, every idea is religious, and it's either correct or it's absolutely incorrect, deadly and from the enemy. And so this kind of mindset of kind of a all or nothing, black and white type of view of society and politics that ended up being very influential in the rise of the Christian right. He was also one of the pioneers of Christian homeschooling. He saw homeschooling as this key mechanism to raise up new generations of young people who would not be indoctrinated by state schools. He viewed the education system as kind of the encapsulation of all that was wrong with America, and his idea of no neutral ideas, really came to the fore in his discussions of government schools and the need to abolish them, to pull kids out, to pursue alternative means of education. And ultimately, he landed on homeschooling as the kind of the key way to do that. So Rushdoony had all sorts of ideas that I think a lot of people, certainly your lay Christian homeschooling families, but also Christian homeschooling leaders would have rejected, not agreed with. But some of his kind of more general philosophy infiltrated, seeped through, influenced kind of all of those folks. And so the generation Joshua generation vision is in many ways kind of an expression of that whole mentality of withdrawing children from the public school system, training them to have a very strong Christian conservative worldview, and then training them to ultimately achieve positions of power and influence. So my twin brother and I, in addition to our nonprofit teen ministry work that we did, we were involved in political campaigning at the local, state, and national level throughout our late teen years and early 20s. we went and worked for some Christian Reconstructionist candidates down in Alabama at one point in our late teen years, and kind of at the time just had no real understanding of the dynamics and the ideas behind the causes that we were promoting. I think in many ways we just took the view that these are Christian men, and they are trying to glorify God, and politics or the law, and so obviously we're on the same team, and this is the right thing to do. And I think there was some naivete there, and just a lack of perspective and historical perspective. But that ultimately led me to Patrick Henry College, to Harvard Law School, to clerking for first Justice Gorsuch when he was a judge on the 10th Circuit here in Denver, and then also Justice Anthony Kennedy at the U.S. Supreme Court. And in many ways, that was kind of the culmination, kind of the dream of the Joshua generation, to have a Christian homeschool graduate kind of in the room where
the room where it happens,
where Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's kind of the key vote on so many important issues to conservatives and evangelicals, was making decisions on major constitutional questions. And I'm so grateful for all of the opportunities I had. They were amazing opportunities, amazing training, and I'm thankful to the men and women who opened the doors for me. And yet I think over time, as I talked about earlier, and I'll pause so you can follow up as opposed to just continuing to talk. Over time, just recognizing there's a way in which Christians can so easily lose, get their eye off the ball when they're so focused on achieving this type of influence, or to be in the room, or to achieve power. That's just such a dangerous thing, and where a movement, or where a generation, or just where an individual kind of is in that space to the point where they lose perspective. That's a very damaging thing to the individual's soul, to the church, to our witness as believers. There's a lot of unhealthiness there when our hope is placed in politics or power instead of where it should be.
Okay, so so much to unpack there, because first of all, I just want to ask you 15 questions about where Gorsuch is on a few things, and you can just explain that to me, because I still got questions. But so when we look, like what you described, that could be a Kuyperian vision, a view of, engaging in this sphere of engaging in government. I want Christians engaged and involved in government. I want Christians clerking for Supreme Court justice. I want Christians. I would love to see an evangelical actually on the Supreme Court. Here we maybe one-ish, overlap with the charismatic Catholic movement, but I'd love to see. I would think that would be a good thing, not a bad thing, to have people of faith in that conversation. So help me clarify for us, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I've hinted at here, so I'll try to say them maybe more clearly.
That is my job, is to ferret out more information. I can be the lawyer in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your turn to step up. So I think first of all, I agree that there can be great benefit in having faithful Christians in these various positions. So the concern is not that vision in itself, but there is a very important soul-forming aspect to where our efforts, our focus, our hope is placed. So it's one thing to say, hey, all things equal, wouldn't it be great to have Christians in these roles? It's another thing to, as I did, form your life around trying to maneuver and position yourself to be in that role as if that's the height of faithfulness to Christ. It's a whole nother thing when a generation or a movement or the church in the United States begins to see political power, influence, or favor as an expression of whether or not they are being faithful Christians. And when that shift takes place, and it's admittedly sometimes a subtle shift, when that shift takes place, it leads to all sorts of distortions. A misplaced hope, I think, gradually robs us of joy. It causes us to be motivated by fear. It causes us to be motivated by a desire to defeat the enemy, as opposed to love our neighbor and turn the other cheek. And I think you see some of the expressions of a church and a movement within the Christian homeschool movement that over time, even with very good motivations, and I will say, so many of the men and women that I met and knew, like, they were pursuing these things out of very good motivations, but over time, I just saw a conflation of faithfulness to Christ with faithfulness to political allies, and a conflation of biblical principles with maybe Republican Party platform. And that is dangerous. And I think an inevitable result of a misplaced hope in politics and in power.
Yeah, it's interesting because people who sort of walk through I guess generically we might say a legalistic context. I know that word that's carrying a lot of weight in that sentence, but
Yep.
your own journey is one where you're still in a conservative evangelical church, but maybe moved away from some of that, Joshua generation ideas. Of course, your brother's Josh Harris, and obviously he went a different direction. I should tell you that I was like, oh gosh, I can't even remember. I was in my basement and I found a stack of Josh's books. I used to give out, was it Humble Orthodoxy? Mm-hmm. And just really just appreciated his spirit and his, in a world where there are a lot of maybe jerks in that theological space, he just had a different tone and space and a tenor about him. And I remember tweeting something, and he actually responded, and we had a little conversation, direct message, and because that was a hard thing for a lot of people. It was that kiss dating goodbye stuff, and I that wasn't my world or my time, but it was more of that humble orthodoxy space. So it seems that there's a lot of people who have, and you can comment how you want to comment about that journey, but it seems that a lot of people, like even in that documentary, Shiny Happy People, there were some like people who were kind of refugees from the movement as well. So how do you see the end result is as Christians who maybe are raised in this case? Is homeschooling going to lead to deconstruction? Or is homeschooling lead to being a Christian lawyer in Denver like you? And what's the difference?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is yes to both. It can lead to success stories, and I acknowledge that in many ways I'm a success story through not entirely on my own merit, just through God's kindness and a family and parents who invested in me and opened doors for me. And then there's also those refugees you mentioned, the people who experienced really horrible abuse, or just some of this kind of very controlling, fear-based, extra biblical, legalistic religion that Shiny Happy People really shines a spotlight.
Right, and that's a big part of the story that we're sort of talking about some of the things that weren't covered in that, but that's a big part of the story that's there. But so do you now? What do you recommend to parents? Should they homeschool their kids? Should they send their kids to public schools? Should they just let them run wild in the fields? What's a better way?
Yeah, I had a great homeschool experience. My wife and I currently homeschool our own daughter, and think it can be a phenomenal option. Unlike what I would have said maybe 10, 15 years ago, it's not the only option for faithful Christian parents. I think the heart of the Christian homeschool movement for so many parents was this desire to really take ownership of the responsibility, the stewardship that God had given them and their children, and to not just farm out education, farm out spiritual formation to youth pastors and to teachers, but to actually take ownership of that themselves. And there's something really healthy in that.
Yeah.
And yet you don't have to homeschool in order to be engaged, to take ownership of those things. So I've been, thankful in our church to see, many faithful brothers and sisters in Christ, going at it different ways, with a very specific vision of what it means to be faithful, very specific understanding of the pros and cons of different approaches. And I think that's just, such a healthy thing. It's going to vary based on where you live and the school options in your area. It's going to vary based on your family circumstances. It's going to vary based on especially this particular child and student in question. So, for our daughter, it's been a great fit so far, but it's not something that we're, think in order to be a faithful Christian, we got to homeschool her all the way through high school, like I was, or like my wife was. We see a lot more freedom in Christ when it comes to those choices.
So, I think it's probably important that we sort of frame a little bit of that. So let's talk then about engaging our culture today. And again, the whole Christian nationalism conversation is a little different than the Rushdoony conversation, is a little different than the Joshua generation conversation. But I think, our audience as pastors and church leaders, I encourage them to stand before the people that God has entrusted to them, to shepherd them in their workplaces, so they might be people of influence. They'd work for the good of their city, their community, and more. So what is a biblically faithful path, since the Joshua generation wasn't as, there are parts of it I think you were affirming, but problematic in some areas. So describe for us what it would look like and how pastors and church leaders can help people get there.
Yeah. One of the things I think is so important, and this is something one of the pastors at our church has really stressed to us in recent years, is just the importance of the discipline of discernment, biblical discernment. I think that's an area where a lot of church members are lacking, and one of the biggest ways that expresses itself, I think, and this ties into everything we've been discussing, is in media consumption. Whether that's political news, talk shows, both TV and radio, social media consumption. I think so much of what has turbocharged, some of the unhealthy aspects of a church that's maybe a little bit too enmeshed in and putting too much hope in political victory or defeat, has been, the rise of just, the constant stream of voices that are very partisan, very ideological, and not necessarily prioritizing, faithful, Christian witness. And so for our churches and for church members to, really take a step back, I always go back to Proverbs, where it says, those who walk with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools suffers harm. Something my dad ingrained in me and my siblings growing up, to think about not just actual human companions, but also our media consumption as a companion that is shaping us, that's forming our hearts and our souls. And when it comes to political engagement in particular, what I found is that I need to get out of the bubble. You get out of the social media bubble, get out of the political foxhole that you can quickly find yourself in as soon as you engage, where if you're both taking bullets, this guy over here sure seems like your best friend at the moment, and then before you know it, his cause is your cause, even if that's not really the cause you're ultimately called to fight for. And I think that dynamic is frequently what happens when people get involved in politics. They start conflating whatever political party makes the most sense for them to support with what it means to be a faithful Christian in the public square. And that sort of blind partisanship over time is I think what hurts the church's witness, what causes so many young people to say, hey, wait a second, what I was taught doesn't seem to be what you're doing. What you claim to believe doesn't seem to be what you actually believe in practice. That's certainly an oversimplification of the deconstruction trend, but I've heard that just so many times from friends, from others. And, I think for the church to get back to a more discerning posture towards politics, but also towards consumption of all of the forms of media that really drive our political climate right now. We have to lead the charge and kind of pulling the plug on that in order to get our church members into a more healthy and more biblical and less reactionary frame of mind.
So some political discipleship, my colleague Vince Bacot at Wheaton would often talk about. At the same time, I think some people listening right now, I don't know if they would have listened this far, but some people who are listening could be saying, we're in a civilizational crisis. I mean, we're the barbarians are at the gate. We need Christians to stand up, take a stand. Matter of fact, people are writing a whole book saying exactly what you're saying is giving permission for Christians to vote Democrat, to move away from standing up for life and biblical morality around sexuality issues and more. Yeah. So how would you respond to, to be honest, that might have been what you were saying a decade or two ago. Yeah. So how do you respond to that?
I first of all, I understand it. I think there are so many things when you look out there that are, and should be concerning to followers of Christ. And we are called to seek the welfare of our communities. And there are ways to do that we can't abdicate as followers of Christ. I think the reason I have a slightly different perspective on it is one, because of that question of hope.
Okay.
It's so it's so easy when we look at all of these trends to take the posture of, if we lose this battle, if we let these people win, if they get their way, Armageddon, this is spiritual cataclysm. That's the message that I received time and time again growing up about all sorts of things.
Sure.
And, so one of the things is just, we've been told that before. And so eventually it starts to feel like maybe it's more a political motivation, fundraising, strategy, or a way to get more views and clicks and likes on social media and whatever form of product someone is pushing or selling, than true conviction or true accurate representation of reality. But the other thing is just ultimately, even with these things, our hope is not in a culture that celebrates Christian values. Would I prefer to live in a culture that does? Absolutely. Do I think there is a role for Christians to stand boldly in support of what the Bible clearly teaches? Absolutely. But we don't do that with our hope being in stemming the tide and creating an environment where Christianity is celebrated. That's not our hope. Our hope is to be faithful to the truth until Christ returns. And that's, that requires sacrifice. That requires action. That's not an abdication, but it's not putting our hope in victory over our enemies. And unfortunately, the mentality of kind of victory over our enemies is a lot more the mentality of our current political culture, as opposed to a true biblical ethic towards political engagement.
So I was, the time of this recording about a week ago, I was sitting on the floor of the House of Representatives, kind of where the Joint Chiefs sit during the State of the Union speech. And we were just doing a thing there. They won't go necessarily into details. It was right after a big chaos day. Hopefully by the time this release, it's actually, some of this is now, we actually have a Speaker of the House and things of that sort, but it's a big chaos day. And we were there for a while, and someone else was talking about something else. And I hate to say this because maybe they hopefully won't listen to this. I was just struck by the fact that, man, I think you put your hope into this House and this future of this government. I mean, it's just not going well. And I think the Church of Jesus Christ has persevered for 2,000 years, but the reality is there are serious questions about the viability of the future way we're going to govern and be in community with one another. And a lot of the people who are some of the worst actors in this current moment are people who identify as evangelical Christians, which is obviously disconcerting at best. But at the same time, I was praying while I was maybe should have been more listening. But part of what I was praying is, Lord, let faithful Christians who have been discipled and shaped by the gospel and the scriptures more than by cable, being discipled by their cable news choices and spiritually shaped by their social media. And so I want more, not less, Christians engaged in the political reality. And I think the last few years have not been a great examples of Christians doing well in this. So could you maybe help us to have a positive vision for what that would look like? And maybe not just in politics, not just, running for office or, being a member of the House, but what would it look like for Christians to do these things? Because the reality is, parents are increasingly speaking up about some of the issues in public schools, and we can sit back and say, well, I wish they would have articulated this differently, but I'm glad some people are articulating some of these things. Yeah. So how do we do it well from somebody who's seen it maybe done badly?
Yeah. Just to be, real honest about my own experience and failings, at the time when I was, very much, following the Joshua generation blueprint and trying to, achieve power and influence and, in order to further that mission, what I quickly found is that there was a whole lot of opportunities to take a stand where taking that stand is actually going to hurt your ability to keep climbing the ladder of influence and power, or could compromise your ability to have a voice in the room, where it happens. And there's this promise in the back of your head that, well, maybe I should say something here, but someday there'll be something even more important. I'll want to be in the room to say that then. And thankfully, my trajectory, changed, but I could easily, have seen myself continuing to tell myself that in perpetuity, and to the point where, maybe I got to that bigger moment, and yet now I had a even bigger moment in my head. And there's just so many steps in which, unfortunately, in our current political climate, and in the fact that in order to, achieve success in politics in the United States today, you have to ally with political parties and political systems and political dynamics that they do in fact push you and maybe even force you to compromise. That the people who are willing to do that and the people who are most successful tend to be the people who at best are compromising, and at worst maybe are just putting on a, playing lip service or claiming an allegiance that they don't actually have. So that's maybe more of a negative, unhelpful, unhopeful point to make. But in terms of what it looks like, to be faithful, that there's, I think Christians should be an aspirational group, and there is a vision, and there's a long history within Christian thought of a vision of a faithful, non-compromising Christian in the public square, who will speak truth to power. And specifically, even at the lowest level, even at the first step of the ladder, is willing to speak the truth, even if that means that's as far as it goes. And I think, that type of faithfulness that really costs people is what we're called to. And if we can, get out of our heads this idea of making sure that we preserve the United States as a, Christian nation in perpetuity, maybe we would see more Christians engaging in that way. And whether or not that changes culture, I don't know. I sure think it'll be a less hypocritical, more faithful representation of what following Christ looks like. And that, in my view, can't help but have a positive effect on the quality and the genuineness of faith within our churches. But that's really, I think, the vision. And there's a vision to do that, like you said, when you're talking about parents, with schools and their own local communities. There's a way to love our neighbor just by keeping our eyes and ears open in the communities where God has placed us. that doesn't come with, and usually when it's national, part of some national cause or movement, it's already been hijacked by some of the unhelpful forces we've talked about. But just being active and seeking to love our neighbor where we are is a great way. That's real politics. That's real. How do we live together as a community? How do we order life? How do we make decisions? That's where I think Christians can be involved. And oftentimes we conflate, politics and public square with national politics and, whatever's being talked about on cable news. And, that's an unhelpful thing. And I think the source of a lot of the negative dynamics that we've discussed.
Alex Harris, still doing hard things. And thanks for having the time to take the conversation with us.
Thank you so much, Ed.
You've been listening to Alex Harris. Be sure to check out Shiny Happy People on Amazon Prime Video. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review that'll help other ministry leaders find and benefit from our content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.